I never thought I'd hear those words from my daughter's mouth. "Get out of here, Mom, or I'll call the cops." She didn't even look at me, just stood there, her arms crossed tight across her chest, like I was some stranger off the street. It was the same front porch where I'd once rocked her to sleep when she had colic, the same doorstep where I dropped off homemade soup when she caught the flu. And now, at 74 years old, I stood there with nothing but my overnight bag and a heart that felt like it had been cracked down the middle. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I just turned around, walked to the edge of the driveway in Coopville's cold November air, and kept walking. I didn't even know where I was going. My name is Susan Thomas, and if you had told me a year ago that my only daughter, Melissa, would one day kick me out of her house like some unwelcome pest, I would have laughed or cried, probably both. I wasn't a perfect mother, who is, but I gave Melissa everything I had. I was widowed young, lost Jack, my husband, to a heart attack when Melissa was only 9. After that, I worked 2 jobs mornings at the elementary school cafeteria, evenings cleaning offices, and when I had time in between, I braided her hair, read her Nancy Drew mysteries, and made sure she always had someone in the audience for her school plays. We were a team, just the 2 of us, even when Melissa got older and became more independent. I stayed close, but not too close. When she met Ethan Carter and said she was in love, I bit my tongue. I had my doubts about him, too slick, too polished, too good at pretending to listen. But I supported her choice. That's what a mother does. They moved into a big new house just 10 minutes from my place. Ethan had done well for himself in real estate, and Melissa followed his lead. When little Sophie was born, I was the first one to hold her after her parents, and from that moment, that girl had my heart. Melissa went back to work 6 weeks after the birth, and I stepped in full time. Diapers, bottles, doctor's visits. I did it all. I never asked for anything in return. I just wanted to help. For years, things were good. I lived alone in my small cottage near Penn Cove, and I'd drive over to Melissa's house each morning. I'd cook, clean, help with Sophie, and make myself invisible when Ethan came home. He never liked having me around too much. Said it disrupted the dynamic of the household. Still, I stayed out of his way. I was there for my daughter and granddaughter, not for him. But something began to shift when Sophie turned 12. Ethan became colder. Melissa grew more distant. I'd bring over muffins or homemade jam, and Melissa would politely take them, but never call later like she used to. I brushed it off. Maybe they were just busy. Then, last month, Ethan suggested it would make sense if I sold my little house and moved in with them permanently. Said it'd be mutually beneficial. I hesitated. Something in his tone made my skin crawl, but Melissa chimed in too, said it was the perfect solution. So I agreed. I sold my cottage, the place Jack and I bought when Melissa was in kindergarten, and moved into their spare room upstairs. At first, it felt fine. I had Sophie's laughter in the evenings, helped around the house, stayed quiet when they needed space, but the rules started piling up fast. Don't use the downstairs bathroom. Please stay in your room after 9 p.m. Don't cook. Ethan is sensitive to smells. It went from kindness to coldness overnight. The final straw came when I tried to surprise Sophie with a batch of her favorite oatmeal raisin cookies before her school concert. Ethan walked in, saw the mixing bowls on the counter, and blew up like I'd set the house on fire. Melissa backed him up. Said I wasn't respecting their boundaries. That night, after Sophie left for rehearsal, Melissa stood at the front door with Ethan beside her and said those words that I'll never forget. Get out, or I'll call the cops. And so I left. I walked for nearly an hour that night, my old bones aching beneath the weight of each step. Coupeville was quiet, only the sound of waves brushing the shore in the distance, and a few porch lights flickering in the darkness. The cold pierced through my sweater, but it couldn't compare to the sting inside my chest. I ended up at the little bench overlooking Penn Cove, the same one where Jack and I used to sit with coffee and watch the seagulls swoop down for scraps. I sat there for a long time, letting the wind whip my hair, and asked myself the same question over and over. How did we get here? Melissa. The memories came fast, like someone had torn open a photo album in my head, scattering the years before me. I was just 24 when I married Jack Thomas. He was a mechanic with oil-stained hands and a crooked grin that never failed to charm me. We didn't have much, but we had enough. Enough love to make a one-bedroom apartment feel like a castle. Enough laughter to drown out the hum of overdue bills. Melissa was born 3 years later, after 2 miscarriages and a lot of prayers. I still remember the moment the nurse placed her in my arms. Her tiny hand wrapped around my pinky, and it felt like my whole purpose in life snapped into place. But fate, it seems, doesn't care much for happiness. When Melissa was 9, Jack collapsed at work, a massive heart attack. They told me he died before he hit the floor. The world didn't stop spinning that day. It just started spinning differently. I was suddenly a single mother, with no savings and no roadmap. I remember staring at the bills that first month, terrified. I didn't know how we were going to survive, but I did what mothers do. I made it work. I picked up hours at the elementary school cafeteria, then took on a cleaning job at night. Some days I only saw Melissa for a few minutes before bedtime, but I made those minutes count. I'd leave little notes in her lunchbox. You are strong. You are smart. Mommy loves you, just so she'd feel less alone. I patched her jeans instead of buying new ones. Sold my wedding ring when the roof started leaking. Skipped meals so she could go on the school field trip to Seattle. And yet, I never once regretted it. Melissa was bright, kind, and always dreaming big. She wanted to be a teacher, then a nurse, then an architect. I told her she could be whatever she wanted, as long as she stayed true to herself. She got a scholarship to Washington State University. I cried for an hour the day we dropped her off at the dorms. I was proud, of course, but also terrified of the silence waiting for me back home. It was just me and the old house now, but I told myself this is what it means to succeed as a mother. You raise them to leave you. She came home every holiday and called once a week. It wasn't the same, but it was enough. I'd save every voicemail, listen to them over again when the nights felt long. And when she met Ethan during her senior year, I was cautious. He was polished, always smiling, but his smile never quite reached his eyes. Still, Melissa glowed when she talked about him, and I thought she deserves her own love story, just like I had with Jack. So I welcomed him with open arms. I helped pay for part of the wedding, sold the last of Jack's tools to cover the cake deposit. I even hemmed her wedding dress myself. She hugged me tight that day and whispered, "I love you. Mama, you've given me everything." It was the last time I heard her say that. After Sophie was born, I was back in my element, changing diapers, singing lullabies, making mashed sweet potatoes from scratch. Melissa needed help, and I was there without hesitation. They said only a few weeks, but a few weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. I never minded. I loved being needed. I loved being near Sophie, watching her grow, seeing Jack's blue eyes reflected in hers. And still, I kept my own home, a little white cottage with creaky floors and peeling paint. But it was mine. It was filled with memories, Jack's recliner still by the window, Melissa's childhood drawings still pinned to the fridge. That house held my life inside it. Selling it felt like cutting off a part of myself. But when Melissa asked me to move in, said it would make more sense, I believed her. I believed she wanted me close, that we were still a team. I didn't see the trap until it snapped shut. Once I was in their house, I became a ghost, a helper, a nuisance, and now I was homeless at 74 years old. The stars blinked above Penn Cove as I sat there, shivering. I thought about sleeping on the bench or walking to the church 2 blocks over. Reverend Paul had always been kind, but more than anything, I thought about that little girl with the tangled hair who used to run barefoot through our backyard, shouting, "I love you, Mommy." Where had she gone? Or maybe the better question was, where had I gone? That night, I ended up walking to the small church near the edge of Coupeville, St. Andrews on the Bluff. It sat on a hill overlooking the water, its old white siding weathered from decades of salt air. I didn't even hesitate before walking up the stone steps. I'd brought soup to potlucks there, lit candles for Jack on the anniversary of his death. I wasn't a regular churchgoer, but that place had always felt like a quiet friend. The side door was unlocked, same as it had always been. I stepped inside, cold and exhausted, and curled up on the back pew with my coat around me. The wood pressed against my ribs, but it was better than the sidewalk. I didn't cry. I was past crying. All I could do was try to sleep. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and a soft voice. "Susan." I opened my eyes and saw Reverend Paul Whitman kneeling beside the pew with a thermos in one hand and a gentle look in his eyes. He was in his late 60s now, gray beard, soft-spoken, with the kind of voice that made you feel like the world hadn't ended yet. "Would you like a warm drink?" he asked. I nodded, trying to sit up. My back screamed in protest. He poured the coffee into a paper cup and handed it to me. "Do you want to talk about what happened?" I didn't want to, but the words tumbled out anyway. I told him everything, how I raised Melissa alone, how I sold my home to move in with her, how she kicked me out like a stranger. He didn't interrupt, didn't flinch, just listened. When I finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. "Some people confuse sacrifice with servitude," he said softly. "And when they're given too much, they stop seeing the giver at all." I stared into my coffee, unable to respond. His words struck a nerve I hadn't even known was raw. He offered me a cot in the church's basement just for a few days, he said, until I figured things out. The room was cold, the walls bare, and the mattress thin, but it had a pillow and a blanket. And right then, that was enough. Over the next few days, I tried to disappear into quiet routines. I helped fold bulletins. I cleaned pews. Anything to feel useful. Reverend Paul never asked me to leave. He gave me space, and in return, I gave him silence. But inside, I was crumbling. 74 years old. No home, no job, no family who wanted me. Melissa didn't call. Sophie didn't write. No one from their house reached out. I was invisible. One evening, while wiping down the church kitchen counters, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman staring back at me didn't look like me. Her face sagged a little lower. Her shoulders drooped. Her eyes once so full of light when Sophie giggled or when Melissa said thanks. Mom were now empty pools. I whispered to myself. How did I let this happen? I had poured everything into other people. My youth, my strength, my love, my home. And in return, I had been cast aside like an old coat someone forgets in the closet. It wasn't just the betrayal that haunted me. It was the question that echoed through my mind in the silence, who am I without them? A few days later, while helping unload canned goods for the church pantry. I met Marjorie Lane. Marjorie was 80 sharp as a tack and had a laugh that filled every corner of the room. She wore bright scarves, called everyone darlin', and had an uncanny knack for noticing pain behind a smile. You're Susan. Right, she said, setting down a box of beans. You're the one who got kicked out by that fancy daughter. I blinked. Word gets around. Huh, this town, please. The seagulls know before the people do. She chuckled. She didn't ask what happened. She just handed me a muffin from her bag and said, We've got a group that meets on Thursdays. Seniors like us folks with time, stories, and nowhere else they really need to be. Come if you like. I hesitated at first, but loneliness is a powerful motivator. That Thursday, I showed up at the Coupeville Senior Center, tucked behind the library. The building was modest, but inside it was warm both in temperature and in spirit. There were couches with Afghans draped over the backs, a coffee pot that never seemed empty, and a bulletin board crowded with hand-drawn flyers for potlucks and dance nights. The group welcomed me like an old friend. No questions, no pity. We played cards, shared stories, swapped recipes, and for the first time in weeks, I laughed, really laughed. It wasn't much, but it was something. Over time, I began to find a rhythm. I took over baking for the center's Saturday brunches. My banana bread became a hit. Marjorie teased me about starting my own cookbook. I told her she was crazy. You think 74 is old, she said one day. Honey, it's halftime. You've got a whole second act waiting. It sounded ridiculous, but part of me wanted to believe it. Still, at night, when I returned to that little cot in the church basement, the silence would creep in. I missed my granddaughter's voice. I missed the creak of my old floors. I missed being loved without condition, but most of all, I missed feeling like I mattered. One afternoon, as I packed up leftover muffins after brunch, Marjorie sat beside me and said gently, You know what your problem is? I raised an eyebrow. No, but I'm sure you'll tell me. You spent your whole life pouring from your cup, and when it finally ran dry, no one was there to fill it back up. Time to find folks who bring you water, Susan. I stared at her, speechless. She smiled. You don't have to go back to the life that broke you, but you do have to build a new one. That was the moment something shifted. For the first time since Melissa slammed the door in my face, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, my story wasn't over. The sun had just begun to peek through the stained glass windows of the church basement when I sat on the edge of my cot, clutching the letter I'd written the night before. I had rewritten it 3 times. Crumpled versions filled the wastebasket beside my bed. But this final version was short, honest, and written with a trembling hand and a trembling heart. Dear Sophie, I miss you more than words can say. I know things are confusing. I know I left suddenly, but I want you to know I never stopped loving you, not for 1 second. If you ever want to talk, I'm still here. Love, Grandma. I slipped the letter into a plain envelope, wrote her name across the front, and placed it gently in my coat pocket. That morning, I walked the same path I had taken the night Melissa forced me out. My hands trembled from the cold, or maybe nerves, as I stood across the street from their house. It looked the same. the perfect white shutters, the neatly trimmed hedges. Melissa always liked things tidy. I used to tend those flower beds myself, pulling weeds in the early morning before Sophie left for school. Now I was just another stranger on the sidewalk. I didn't ring the bell. I couldn't. I simply opened the mailbox, tucked the letter inside, and walked away. For days, I waited. I told myself not to get my hopes up, but every time someone opened the church door or my phone buzzed, my heart would leap, but no call came, no visit, no letter in return. At the Thursday senior gathering, I could barely focus. I stirred my coffee more than I drank it. Marjorie noticed. "You heard from her." "Yet," she asked. I shook my head. Maybe she never even saw it. She saw it. Marjorie said firmly, "Kids don't miss letters with their names on the front, especially when they're written by someone who raised them." "But what if Melissa threw it out?" I whispered. "What if she made Sophie hate me?" Marjorie leaned back and crossed her arms. "Then that girl's got two choices: believe what she's told, or believe what she remembers." The words sank deep. I wanted so badly for Sophie to remember the bedtime stories, the chocolate chip pancakes on snow days, the way I held her when she cried over a scraped knee. But the longer the silence stretched, the more I feared those memories were buried under someone else's bitterness. A week later, I tried again. This time, I didn't write. I walked. On a crisp Sunday afternoon, I made my way through the winding neighborhoods and found myself at Coopville High School, just in time to see students trickling out of a weekend choir rehearsal. I waited near the corner of the lot, watching faces pass. Then, there she was, Sophie, taller than I remembered, her chestnut hair pulled into a bun. She walked with the quiet confidence of someone on the cusp of adulthood, but she still looked like my little girl, the same freckles on her cheeks, the same slight slouch when she carried a heavy backpack. I stepped forward and called out softly, "Sophie." She turned, startled. Her eyes widened. For a moment, just one fleeting second, I saw recognition, then hesitation, then confusion. "Sophie," I said again. "It's Grandma. I wanted to see you." She looked around nervously, then said in a quiet voice, "You're not supposed to be here." The words hit me like ice water. "I just wanted to tell you I love you," I said, my voice barely steady. "That's all." She looked at her feet. "Mom said you left because you didn't want to live with us anymore." My heart cracked in half. "That's not true," I said, trying to stay calm. "I left because she told me to. I would have stayed forever if it meant being close to you." Sophie looked up. Her eyes shimmered. "I don't know who to believe anymore," she whispered. And then she turned and walked away. I stood there long after she disappeared. It would have been easier if she had yelled, if she had said she hated me. But that quiet uncertainty, that torn look in her eyes, was somehow worse. I walked back to the church with my chest hollow and my feet sore, feeling every one of my 74 years. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word in my head. I felt like I'd failed again. Failed as a mother. Failed as a grandmother. Failed at being needed. But as dawn crept in through the basement windows, something inside me shifted. I realized I'd spent my whole life defining myself through others, through what I gave them, what I did for them, how I made their lives easier. And now that no one wanted what I had to give, I felt invisible. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe I had forgotten how to exist just for me. Maybe it was time I stopped waiting for someone else to rescue me and started rescuing myself. The next morning, I asked Reverend Paul if I could use the small church kitchen once a week. For what, he asked. To bake. I said, for the community center, I've got a banana bread recipe that needs reviving. He smiled, handed me the keys, and said, just don't burn the place down. That Wednesday, I baked 12 loaves, wrapped them in foil, added little tags with handwritten notes, fresh from Susan T., and a smiley face. Marjorie brought one to the librarian. Someone else gave one to the postmaster. By Thursday, people were asking for more, and for the first time in weeks, I felt valuable, not because I was someone's mother or grandmother, but because I was me. One evening, as I cleaned the counters in the church kitchen, Marjorie leaned on the doorframe with a smirk. You know, she said, you could start a little side business with these, seniors helping seniors or something catchy like that. I laughed. Please, I'm too old for all that. She raised an eyebrow. You're never too old to be needed. And I realized maybe she was right. Maybe I didn't need Melissa's approval or Ethan's permission. Maybe I didn't even need Sophie's validation, not yet. Maybe I just needed to rebuild a life that no one else could take away again, one batch of banana bread at a time. The following weeks passed in a gentle rhythm, a quiet kind of healing that crept in like morning sun through a kitchen window. Each Wednesday morning, I would roll up my sleeves in the church kitchen and bake until the walls smelled like cinnamon, nutmeg, and warm vanilla, banana bread, zucchini muffins, apple cobbler when the orchard down the road had a surplus. I didn't have much, but I had time and hands that still knew how to stir love into a mixing bowl. Word got around. A woman named Patricia, who ran the small hardware store downtown, came by one Sunday with her grandson just to say, "Thank you for the pumpkin loaf." My husband smiled for the first time in months. Then a widower named George Kramer, retired Navy, stopped me on the sidewalk outside the post office. "You're the bread lady, right?" he said with a wink. "You got anything with walnuts?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Come by Thursday. I'll have a surprise for you." I wasn't making money, but I was making something that mattered, something that made people feel cared for, and it made me feel like I had a place again. Not in a family that had pushed me out, but in a community that had quietly welcomed me in. Still, there were nights when I'd sit alone in the church basement, and the silence would sneak in like fog through the cracks in the windows. I missed Sophie with an ache so deep it felt like an echo inside my bones. I missed the way she used to slip her little hand into mine at the grocery store, the way she'd perch on a stool while I kneaded dough and ask, "Grandma, how do you make it taste like hugs?" I wondered if she ever thought of me. I wondered if she still believed the version of the story Melissa had told her that I had chosen to leave, that I had walked away from the people I loved more than anything, and then I'd feel it again, that knot in my stomach, that hollow in my chest. No one prepares you for this kind of heartbreak. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind where your phone doesn't ring, where your mailbox stays empty, where people you love pretend you never existed. But I kept baking, kept showing up at the senior center, kept helping Reverend Paul with the food pantry. Because if there was one thing I had learned from losing Jack, from raising Melissa alone, from starting over in the back room of a church, it was this: you survive one day at a time. Then one Thursday afternoon, something shifted. I had just finished slicing fresh banana bread at the senior center when Marjorie walked in with a glint in her eye and said, "You have a visitor." I wiped my hands on a towel. "Who?" She grinned. "Come and see." Standing near the door, nervously fidgeting with the sleeve of her jacket, was a young woman with chestnut hair tied back in a braid. Sophie. My breath caught. I didn't move. I was afraid if I did, the image would disappear like a dream too good to be true. She looked older. Her face had lost its baby-soft roundness, but her eyes were still mine, still Jack's. "Hi, Grandma," she said softly. "That word, Grandma, it nearly brought me to my knees. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me," she said. I crossed the room slowly. "Sophie," I whispered, "of course I want to see you. I've waited every day, hoping I would." She looked down. "I found your letter. Mom didn't throw it away. She just hid it." I felt my heart twist. "I read it one night when I couldn't sleep," she continued, "and I remembered everything. The stories, the cookies, the way you'd hum when you did laundry. I remembered you. Tears spilled before I could stop them. I reached out, and she stepped into my arms. We stood there in the middle of the senior center, wrapped around each other like time hadn't passed, like love hadn't been buried under silence and lies. We sat down in the corner with 2 mugs of tea, and she told me everything. How Ethan had been pushing Melissa further from her roots, how he insisted on control over every little thing, including who was welcome in their home, how Melissa had grown colder over the years, more defensive, more afraid of losing the life she'd built. "How could she throw you out?" Sophie asked, voice shaking. "You raised her alone. You gave her everything. I think. I gave her so much she forgot I was still a person," I said quietly. Sophie nodded, then pulled something from her bag. It was a small envelope worn, with a flower sticker on the back. "I wrote this after I found your letter," she said. "I was going to mail it, but I wanted to give it to you in person." I opened it later that night, after she'd gone. Inside was a note, written in her neat teenage handwriting. "Grandma, you were always my safe place. I don't care what Mom says, I know who you are. I hope one day I can be as strong as you. I love you, always. Love, Sophie." I held that note to my chest and cried soft, quiet tears that washed over the ache I had carried for so long. She remembered. She came back, and that changed everything. After that Thursday at the senior center, Sophie began visiting me once a week, always after school, always quietly. She never told her parents, and I never asked her to. It was our little secret one we protected like a flame in the wind. She'd meet me at the church kitchen, or sometimes at the wooden bench overlooking Penn Cove. We'd share tea, stories, and moments we'd lost to silence. I taught her how to make biscuits from scratch. She brought me poetry she'd written for her English class. We laughed, really laughed, and every time she called me Grandma, something inside me healed a little more. But behind her soft smile, I could see it the weight she carried at home. She never said much about Melissa, but when I asked how things were, her answers were brief. "Mom's been tense." Ethan's always working late. I don't know. It just feels heavy. I wanted to wrap her in my arms and take her far away from it all. But she was nearly grown, and I knew all too well that some things had to be lived through to be understood. Still, I reminded her often, "You are never alone, sweetheart. No matter what happens." She'd squeeze my hand and say, "I know, I have you." One afternoon, as we sat in the pews folding bulletins, she asked me something that stopped me cold. "Grandma, do you think Mom regrets what she did?" I looked at her, unsure how to answer. "I think people don't always realize what they're doing until it's too late," I said carefully. "And sometimes the guilt makes them dig in deeper instead of facing it. She nodded slowly. I don't think she's happy. Not really. I believed her. Melissa had made her choice when she sided with Ethan, when she raised her voice at me instead of raising questions. But I also knew, deep down, that fear had a way of turning love sour. She had become a woman so focused on preserving her picture-perfect life that she forgot who helped build the frame. That night, I baked a double batch of cornbread and left a few pieces wrapped in wax paper at the church steps with a note. For anyone who needs comfort, from someone who finally found hers. A week later, Reverend Paul called me into his office. I had someone stop by yesterday, he said, eyes searching mine. Your daughter. My heart skipped. She didn't come in, just stood at the door. Said she was looking for someone named Susan, but then left before I could say a word. I sat down, hands trembling slightly. She looked lost. He added, not angry, not proud, just tired. I didn't know what to feel. Hope, dread, sadness. Part of me wanted to march right up to her front door and say, do you see what you threw away? But another part, the deeper, older part of me knew she wasn't ready. She hadn't been ready for a long time, so I let it be. If she was truly searching, I'd let her come in her own time. Sophie continued to come each week, even as winter rolled in and the wind off the cove grew sharp. Sometimes she'd bring extra food from home. Sometimes just a hug and a story. One Friday, she showed up with a tattered photo album in her backpack. I found it in a box in the garage. She whispered, it's ours. We flipped through the pages together. Melissa at age 5, holding a sparkler on the 4th of July. Me and Jack in front of the old house with the peeling shutters. Sophie's first birthday frosting on her nose. Both of us laughing. We lingered on one picture longer than the rest. It was from the night of Melissa's high school graduation. I had made her a dress blue with little white daisies. She had her arms around my neck, her eyes bright with pride. She loved you then, Sophie said quietly. I know, I whispered back. And I loved her enough for both of us. One evening, Sophie showed up with a folded letter. It's from Mom, she said, not meeting my eyes. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, a few short sentences. Mom, I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this, but I think about you every day. I hope someday you'll let me make it right. Melissa. No grand gesture, no excuses, just truth raw and uncertain. I folded it carefully and set it aside. I don't know what to do with that. I said, you don't have to do anything yet. Sophie replied, just keep it for when you're ready. That night, I sat alone in the church kitchen long after everyone had gone home. The letter sat on the table beside my tea. I wasn't ready to forgive, but I was ready to stop being angry. And that, I realized, was its own kind of freedom. The letter stayed folded on my nightstand for 2 full weeks, every evening. I'd glance at it and feel something twist inside me. Not anger, not anymore just the ache of unfinished words. Sophie kept visiting. She never pushed. She just brought her light, her warmth, her steady presence. And in that space between us, I began to realize something. I didn't need Melissa's apology to keep living my life, but I did need to tell my truth, not for her sake, for mine. So, one Sunday afternoon, I asked Reverend Paul if I could borrow the church hall for an hour. He raised an eyebrow. You expecting a crowd? No, I said, just one person I used to know very well. I wrote Melissa a note handwritten, just like she used to love when she was little. I gave it to Sophie to deliver, sealed in a simple white envelope. Melissa, if you want to talk, I'll be at St. Andrews at 3:00 p.m. on Sunday. No demands, no drama, just a conversation. Mom. I didn't know if she'd come. Part of me thought she wouldn't. That she'd tuck the letter away like everything else she didn't want to face. But when the clock struck 3, I sat on the small wooden bench near the altar and waited anyway. At 3:07, I heard the doors creak open. Melissa walked in slowly, arms crossed tight over her chest, like she was holding herself together. Her hair was pulled back in a knot. No makeup, just her, raw and quiet. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, eyes wide with something I couldn't name. Guilt, shame, grief. I motioned for her to sit. She hesitated, then sank into the pew across from me. The silence stretched like a fragile thread. I wasn't sure you'd come, I said finally. She nodded. I wasn't sure I would either. I took a breath. My hands trembled slightly in my lap. I read your letter, I said, and I appreciate it. I truly do. She swallowed hard. I didn't know how else to start. I studied her face, the lines around her mouth, the tiredness in her eyes. This wasn't the polished woman who stood on her front porch and screamed for me to leave. This was my daughter. The little girl who used to crawl into my bed after thunderstorms, who called me her best friend when she was 10. Melissa, I said gently. I didn't come here to punish you. I came here to speak the words I kept quiet for too long. She looked at me, startled. You hurt me, I said. You didn't just ask me to leave, you made me feel like I didn't belong, like I was disposable. And that pain, it broke something inside me I didn't know could break. Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't mean I raised a hand. Please, let me finish. She nodded slowly. I gave you my life, I said, every breath, every penny, every ounce of love I had. And I did it gladly, not because I expected something in return, but because I believed in us, in the bond between mother and daughter. She blinked hard. A tear slipped down her cheek. When you married Ethan, I tried to trust your choice, even when I felt uneasy, even when I saw the way he looked through me like I was clutter in the corner. I stayed because I loved you, and because I adored Sophie. A sob caught in her throat. But when things got hard, when Ethan got louder, and you got quieter, you didn't protect me. You turned me into a burden, and then you threw me away. She buried her face in her hands. I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty, I said, my voice cracking. I'm saying it because I need you to know that I see it now, all of it. I see how I let myself become small just to stay close, how I lost my voice trying to make you comfortable. Melissa looked up, red-eyed. I was scared. I know, I said softly. So was I. She exhaled a long, trembling breath. I thought Ethan was right, that you were taking over, that you didn't respect our space. I gave a faint smile. I was trying to fill the silence your marriage created. I didn't realize you resented me until it was too late. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the pew. He's not the man I thought he was. He controls everything, the money, the schedule, even how I parent Sophie. I nodded slowly. And you let him. For years. She winced. I'm not saying this to blame you, I added. I'm saying this because I love you too much to lie anymore. There was a long silence, just the two of us breathing, hearts pounding in the echo of an old church that had heard more prayers than confessions. I don't know how to fix this, she whispered. I nodded. Neither do I. but I know the first step." She looked at me, eyes wide. "Truth," I said, without excuses, without fear. She reached across the space between us and took my hand. "I'm sorry." "Mom," she whispered, "I've been sorry every single day." I squeezed her fingers gently. "I know," I said. "Now show me." We didn't solve everything in that one conversation. Healing doesn't happen all at once, but something shifted that day. For the first time in years, Melissa listened without defending, and I spoke without shrinking. That was the beginning, not of going back, but of going forward with clear eyes, firm boundaries, and the knowledge that love is only real when it's honest. After that day in the church, Melissa and I didn't talk every day, but we talked. A cautious kind of rebuilding began between us. She sent small notes, checked in, apologized in quiet ways, not with grand gestures, but with presence. She even showed up at the senior center once, unannounced, holding a tray of deviled eggs. "They're not as good as yours," she muttered. The women there welcomed her warmly, as if they'd been waiting for her all along. Marjorie gave her a tight nod, then looked at me with raised brows that said, well, Melissa was different, softer, less guarded. I could see the guilt clinging to her like fog, but she was trying, and trying meant more to me than words ever could. Ethan, on the other hand, didn't change. He stayed distant, dismissive, refused to acknowledge what had happened. I didn't press Melissa about it, but I could see the toll it was taking. Sophie confided in me one afternoon over tea. "I think she's scared to leave him. She says she's trapped." I sighed, brushing a crumb from the table. We all have to find our own way out, even if it takes longer than we want. In the meantime, I continued building something for myself. What started as banana bread and muffins in the church kitchen grew into something real. Reverend Paul encouraged me to host a weekly comfort baking class in the church hall. People showed up, older folks, widows, even a few teenagers. We didn't just bake. We talked. We shared stories and grief and silly laughter. We braided life together with flour and sugar and cinnamon. It wasn't just a class. It was communion. Marjorie helped organize it all. I told you, "Darlin', you're halftime, not the final act." And for the first time in decades, I believed her. A woman named Tanya from the local newspaper came by one Saturday to do a short feature on our group. She snapped photos of my flour-covered apron, the old oven, the round table where we sat kneading dough like it was memory itself. The headline read, "From Rock Bottom to Rising Loaf, One Woman's Recipe for Belonging." I clipped the article and pinned it beside my cot. It wasn't about fame. It was about proof. Proof that my life didn't end when I was cast out of my daughter's home. It began again quietly, sweetly, and on my own terms. Then, something unexpected happened. The church committee offered me a small upstairs office that had once been a dusty storage room. They cleaned it out, added a chair, a small sofa, and a window that overlooked the cove. It wasn't much, but to me, it was sanctuary, a real room, with a door I could lock, a space that belonged to me. I moved in that spring. Packed my few belongings from the church basement, folded my linens with care, and placed Sophie's letter and my wedding photo on the new windowsill. It wasn't my old house, but it was mine. One evening, Sophie curled up on the little sofa and said, "I like it here. It smells like nutmeg and old books." I smiled. That's probably just me. She looked around. "You know, you've made a life out of scraps. Grandma." I paused, What do you mean? She shrugged. You lost your home. Your daughter turned on you, but you took the pieces and made something beautiful. Most people just fall apart. I held her gaze. I did fall apart, sweetheart, but I didn't stay that way. She rested her head on my shoulder. I want to be like you when I'm old. I kissed the top of her head and whispered, then never let anyone shrink you down, not even the people you love. Spring in Coupaville came like a sigh after a long-held breath. Cherry blossoms bloomed along the sidewalks. The cove shimmered under gentler light, and the senior center was busier than ever. My little baking group had doubled in size. We had new members, from teenagers trying to escape their phones to widowers aching for community. One Thursday afternoon, we gathered around the kitchen island, dusted with flour and laughter. George Kramer was trying and failing to braid challah bread, while two teen girls helped Marjorie adjust her apron with hot pink glitter letters that read, "Whisk Taker." Someone knocked gently on the hall door. It was Melissa. She stood there awkwardly, holding a tray of cinnamon scones. I made these, she said, clearing her throat. From that old recipe you used to love. No one spoke at first. Then Marjorie, never one to miss a beat, said, "Well, don't just stand there, honey. Bring 'em in before they cool off." Melissa stepped into the room. I caught her eye, and for the first time in years, there was no defensiveness, just humility. She joined our group at the table, listened, helped, laughed, even afterward, as we cleaned up side by side at the sink. She whispered, "Mom, I want to be better. I want Sophie to see a different version of me." I didn't promise her forgiveness that day, but I did offer her something better, a second chance to earn it. Weeks passed. Melissa kept coming once a week, sometimes more, always quiet, always unsure, but always trying. She and Sophie began going to therapy together. One afternoon, Sophie told me, Mom finally admitted she was afraid of Ethan, afraid of being alone, afraid that asking for help would mean she was weak. I looked out the window at the gentle sway of the water. Being afraid doesn't make you weak, I said. Pretending you're not afraid, that's what makes you brittle. Then, one morning in May, Melissa knocked on my church office door. I left him, she said, eyes full of both fear and relief. I packed up. I took Sophie. We're staying with a friend for now. I stood slowly and opened my arms. She walked into them like a woman who had been holding her breath for a decade. We stood there for a long time, and this time, when she cried, I didn't cry with her. I held her steady, like a tree that had been through every storm but still stood strong. That summer, something extraordinary happened. A woman from the Washington State Aging and Care Network heard about our Thursday baking group. She came to observe one session, then another. A month later, she sat me down with a folder. "Susan," she said, "we'd like to help you expand this into a county-wide pilot program for seniors, something small but official. We'll provide space, ingredients, and a small stipend for you to oversee it." I blinked, stunned. "You mean, make this a job?" She smiled. "We mean, make this a movement." The program launched that fall under the name Whisk Together. It began in Coupeville, but soon reached Oak Harbor and even Port Townsend. We weren't just baking anymore. We were building connection, dignity, belonging, and somehow, in the middle of all that dough and love and healing, I found something I didn't know I still had. A purpose bigger than my pain. One evening, after a particularly joyful class, I sat on the bench overlooking Penn Cove with Sophie beside me. She rested her head on my shoulder. You know what I think, Grandma. What's that I think getting kicked out saved your life? I chuckled softly. Well, I don't recommend it. She smiled. But it brought you here, to all of this. And now you're helping other people who thought their best years were behind them. I looked at the stars above the cove, shimmering like soft punctuation marks to a chapter I once thought was the end. And I whispered, maybe our best years begin when we finally stop living for the people who don't see us. The first autumn wind swept through Coupeville with a whisper of golden leaves and fresh beginnings. I stood beneath the maple tree just outside the senior center, watching Sophie help hang a hand-painted banner for our Thursday baking group's 1-year anniversary. Whisked together, where every loaf has a story. There was music playing from a small speaker. Marjorie was passing out hot cider. Melissa stood a few steps away, chatting with a woman from the library. She looked peaceful, lighter, and me, I felt whole. Not because everything had been fixed, but because I had stopped waiting to be rescued. I had saved myself. Later that evening, after the crowd had thinned and the ovens had cooled, Sophie and I sat on the church steps with slices of warm cornbread on napkins. She leaned against me and said, "Do you remember that day I saw you outside school? When I told you not to be there, I nodded. The memory still stung. I was scared," she said. "Not of you, of what Mom might do. But when I walked away that day, it hurt more than anything. Because deep down, I never wanted to lose you." I wrapped an arm around her shoulder. "I never stopped waiting for you to come back." She looked up at me, eyes glistening in the fading light. "You're the strongest person I know," she whispered. I didn't respond right away, because for the first time in my 75 years, I believed it. If there's anything I've learned, it's this. Sometimes the people we love most are the very ones who hurt us in ways we never thought possible, but their failure to see your worth doesn't make you worthless. It makes your resilience even more precious. For years, I lived in the background, quiet, supportive, swallowing my voice to keep the peace. But the day my daughter slammed that door in my face, I lost everything I thought defined me and found everything that truly did. I found that I was capable of rebuilding. I found community in strangers. I found purpose in flour and cinnamon and love kneaded into warm bread. And I found that healing doesn't come from going back. It comes from rising forward. So if you're sitting in silence right now, if you've been made to feel small, forgotten, or cast aside, let me tell you something. From one heart to another, you are not done. You are not broken. You are not too late. You are becoming. If this story touched something inside you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us, have you ever had to start over? What helped you heal? And if you'd like more stories like this, stories of resilience, truth, and the beauty of second chances, please subscribe and stay with us. Because here, you're never too old, never too far gone, and never, ever alone.